Have you ever read a book and picked up on some obscure reference or piece of trivia, something you've never really heard of or thought of before, and then later that week you come across it again, and then you hear about it again? What is happening here? You've never really heard of this thing, and now all of a sudden it seems like it's everywhere. It can definitely be a little surreal and maybe even a little bit creepy. You kind of get this feeling that the universe is conspiring to put this thing in front of you, and why? The good news is, you're not crazy. The even better news is, this is one of the best parts of reading, and you can take advantage of it. This is actually something called frequency illusion, and you might hear it more commonly referred to as the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, which is when something you just learned about or something that is now relevant to your life suddenly seems to pop up everywhere. It's weird, it's a little creepy, but it's actually due to a couple of cognitive processes. The first is called selective attention. This is when something has already caught your attention, so you're already kind of unconsciously attuned to it in the world around you. Now this makes sense because a million different things cross our paths every day, and we can't possibly pay attention to all of them. We would go crazy if we did. So our brains filter most of those things out. The second is called confirmation bias, which just sort of confirms our belief that whatever we're suddenly attuned to is suddenly becoming more popular or more common in the world around us. Common examples of this might be when you get a new car or a particular color car, and all of a sudden everywhere you drive you see that same car or that same color car also driving on the road around you. I was thinking about this recently as it relates to books because I finished this book called Breathless by Amy McCullough. This book is a thriller. It's set on the mountain peak called Manaslu in Nepal. It's an 8,000 meter peak, one of only 14 in the world. Now, I'm not an extreme mountaineer and don't really have any interest in becoming one, even though I live in the Rocky Mountains. I have to admit that part of my interest in this is trying to wrap my head around why people do this crazy extreme sport. Anyway, in this book, a famous mountaineer is attempting to climb all 14 8,000 meter peaks in under a year. This big feat is kind of the catalyst for the thriller story that follows. But just a couple days after finishing this book, I was scrolling through Netflix and I came across this documentary called 14 Peaks. Nothing is impossible. This documentary follows Nepali mountaineer Nims Purja on his attempt to climb all 14 8,000 meter peaks in under 7 months. Now, this is not a coincidence that Amy McCullough wrote about this topic because she actually climbed with Nims Purja on her own attempt to climb Manaslu in 2019. But what felt like a coincidence or like divine intervention or something was that I came across this documentary, something which I rarely watch, so soon after reading about this very topic in a fiction thriller that I read for enjoyment. Of course, it's really not as big of a coincidence as it seems. This is a recent documentary. Nims Purja's attempt to climb these mountains was a huge deal in the mountaineering community. And of course, Netflix documentaries cross my screen all the time. I just don't tend to pay much attention to them. But because I was attuned to it already, I was interested in what these mountains look like. I wanted to know what it takes to climb them and really why these crazy people do this. I paid more attention as I scrolled by on Netflix. In another example that ended up feeling kind of meta, while I was looking into this idea of frequency illusion and how the things you read in books suddenly pop up in your real life, I came across this tweet from author Linda Holmes. I always know when yips are in the news. For context, Linda Holmes wrote this wonderful rom-com called Evie Drake Starts Over. And in this book, one of the main characters is a professional baseball player who is suffering from the yips, which is what they call it when players kind of lose their magic on the field, seemingly overnight with no discernible reason. So for readers like me, non-baseball fans, Linda Holmes' novel, Evie Drake Starts Over, is probably their point of reference when they hear the term the yips. And so when they hear the term somewhere, they think of Evie Drake Starts Over, and then they let Linda Holmes know about it. Now, this is probably a term they've heard in the world before. I'm sure I have, but until they have this context of a character they now know and understand, it really didn't register in their brains until after they read this book. Anyway, there are actually ways that you can take advantage of this idea of frequency illusion when you're reading to make your reading experience richer and to help you relate to the world around you and the world that the book is bringing into your life a little bit more deeply. So the first way you can do this is just to read it all. And that should really go without saying if you're watching this video. Presumably, you're already a reader. But reading often and widely helps us see new patterns in the world and synthesize ideas and kind of make meaning of it all. The second is to take note of minor details, both things that come up in books and things in the world. And just take a moment to kind of examine these details. You know, look something up, talk to somebody about it. You don't have to become an expert on everything, and likely you won't become an expert on this thing you're looking into. But it's kind of exciting to think that some little detail that strikes a chord in you that you look into more deeply could actually be something that ends up changing your life. When you think about it, we did this so often when we were kids. Something would strike up our curiosity and we would just examine it, and it would help us make sense of the world. And so often those interests would take us on different paths toward, hobbies or even career paths later in life. And that natural curiosity is something many of us often feel like we kind of lose as adults when we're just meandering through the world and not following those little interesting paths that we find in little topics. The trick here is really just trying to continue to do that as an adult. The next way you can use frequency illusion is to connect with others about it. Now, Linda Holmes's readers found a way to connect with her about this idea of the yips. It's still probably nothing important in most of their daily lives, but they read about it in the book, it stuck with them, and now it's a point of connection with the author and with other readers who also learned about this concept by reading a story that they love. To dovetail on this, I think we can use frequency illusion to more deeply connect with characters and also appreciate the power of story in our lives and how it helps us learn. Maybe these readers of Evie Drake Starts Over weren't baseball fans, or they never knew anyone who had the yips before, but when a character they cared about had them, suddenly it started to make sense. They understood what it was, but they also understood the emotional implications of it, the physical ramifications, the financial ramifications, and all of these ways that having the yips affected this character and in turn might affect a real person who had this affliction. Suddenly this abstract concept of the yips becomes a real thing that has a real impact on someone. So then there's that moment when it flips from, oh, I've heard about the yips, to more of, oh, I've heard about the yips, I know how it could affect someone, I know how it affects their lives, and I know how this sports figure or this person who has it might be feeling and might be suffering. In other words, empathy. Now, in the grand scheme of things, the yips seems like a minor affliction, but it's still a good example of how books teach us empathy. And by paying attention to the things that we read about and the things that happen to the characters that we care about in books, it makes us more attuned to the things happening in the world and makes us more empathetic to the things that are happening to the people around us. Whether you're convinced it's coincidence or not, I'm not fully convinced it's coincidence that I ran across Linda Holmes's tweet while I was researching frequency illusion. Once you start paying attention, you too are likely to have moments that feel just a little bit too coincidental. And you might start to wonder, are there cosmic forces bringing this topic in front of you again and again? Whatever you believe, maybe just try to get past the creepiness and take it as a sign that maybe you should dig a little bit deeper into that topic. Pay attention to when it comes up around you and pay attention to the details. You just might be glad you did. I'd love to hear your own experiences with frequency illusion and how things that you read about or learned about have just sort of started cropping up in your life again and again, and maybe they've prompted you to learn a little bit more about it or take something into your own life that you might not have before. Go ahead and comment below with your own experiences. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.